A new threat, a being named Rogol Zar, who claimed to be the one who originally destroyed Krypton, has, for now, been defeated. Superman and Supergirl know they need to learn more about this new threat, and Kara promises to do exactly that. It means she's going to have to leave for a while. She's going to find out the truth about Krypton and Kryptonians. She's going to learn what else Rogol Zar knew about them. She will find out if this strange new alien was lying. Superman doesn't think he was, and wonders how long Kara will be gone. With Lois and John also off planet, the news is distressing. Kara only promises she'll be back, and his family will be back too. Clark admits that he lost contact with his family out in space. Supergirl promises if she sees them out there, she'll let them know what's happened. In the meantime, the Justice League has one more thing to do. For Kandor. Number 9, Man of Steel. Alright, so now we go into the worst list full-fledged with our first comic book series, as voted by our fans for being one of the worst comic book stories of that year. And I have to tell you, Man of Steel was a pretty surprising choice to me. It wasn't one of the ones I had made in terms of what I would have put on my personal worst 10 of the year. But that doesn't mean I'm upset with it being here. Surprised doesn't mean that I disagree with it. Really, it just means I didn't really think of it or thought of it as something that was the worst out of what we got this year. But now that it's here, now that I'm looking at it, and now that I'm thinking about it, yeah, there's some stuff worth talking about here, and yeah, I see the justification for us talking about this series on this list. Last year, in 2018, it was announced that Brian Michael Bendis, longtime writer for Marvel and creator of such characters as Miles Morales, was leaving Marvel Comics and coming over to DC in order to start writing for their characters. That announcement was pretty big in the comic book community, and unless you've been out of the loop of that stuff, you probably heard something about it. Why it's such a big deal is that for years and years, Bendis was a staple Marvel writer. He was a go-to in a lot of ways, responsible for writing a lot of their crossover events and major series ranging from the Avengers to the all-new X-Men to the aforementioned Ultimate Spider-Man, which led to his creation of characters such as Miles Morales. Characters with major staying power that ended up having a big influence on the best of 2018 list, as we'll be going forward with that, and just creating a lot of really fun stories that were influential in making me a comic book reader myself. And I'm not the only one who can say that. A lot of people out there are deeply influenced by Bendis and really consider him a big writer in the world of comic books, especially with Marvel. So, the move was a big deal to begin with, and one worth talking about, as we did throughout the year. A lot of people were excited for the move, and for good reason. When pushed or in the right position, he can do phenomenal work to this day. But part of the reason that a lot of people weren't so keen on this move, and a lot of people were very skeptical about all of this, was because Bendis isn't that consistent in his writing. And I mentioned that he wrote a lot of Marvel's crossover events, but a lot of those are terrible. A big example of that is one of the most recent events he did, Civil War II, which, while it had a good start if you ask me, fell apart quickly when it ended up being nothing but build-up to a very small and deflated event that truly, profoundly didn't feel like a civil war between the superheroes. It was awful, and one of the last major things Bendis did before he left Marvel to come over to DC. So you can understand why a lot of people were skeptical about how Bendis would work as a DC writer, and considering how well DC was doing with Rebirth, he felt like an unwelcome presence to a lot of viewers. We had no way of predicting what was going to happen, and anyone who told you otherwise was lying. They couldn't have known. No one could have known until we saw the series and comics Bendis was going to produce under DC. One of the reasons that I was pretty hopeful about all of this was that I figured the change in company, and therefore characters and settings and all that stuff, would be a strong change of pace for Bendis and give his writing a much needed shot in the arm, an energy that had been lacking in the last few years that we'd only see him break out of every once in a while most of his comics these days felt mediocre, mundane, and just lacking the energy of some of his best works. So a lot was riding on this Man of Steel series. Not only was it Bendis' first take at a major turn in writing DC characters, but he was basically given the full control over Superman and all related characters in DC Comics. So for them to make this move shows a lot of confidence in the man. Confidence that if I were in the position to be making decisions over at DC, I would never have done this. I would have probably stuck Bendis to characters more along his lines, younger characters along the lines of Spider-Man, either the Titans or Teen Titans, or characters who aren't necessarily younger per se, but fit more with his sensibilities. The biggest one I can think of being Booster Gold, who would work nicely with Bendis' sense of humor and ability to take characters like that and write them in a very sincere and interesting way. But no, they gave him Superman, a questionable decision from the beginning, and one that this series really doesn't sell me on in big ways. When it came out and after it had come out, I had been somewhat defensive of it, mostly along the lines of me not being overly concerned with them basically sending Lois and John off into space. Bendis had been very clear that these characters are coming back, and that's good because it was a core part of Rebirth-era Superman and why this character was working so well compared to his history as a comic book character. Giving Superman a family turned out to be essential in making Superman a likable character. And that's a big problem with Bendis coming over to DC Comics and being given Superman of all characters in the Rebirth era. Because a big issue with all of this is that the Superman comics before Bendis took over not only were great, not only had a strong status quo that probably shouldn't have been tampered with, but looking back on it now that Bendis has had some time to write some of his own Superman comics and we have a better picture of what he's going to be doing with the character, those older pre-Bendis comics were far superior to the ones that we're getting now that Bendis has taken over. And that is a damning thing that I think nicely summarizes what is wrong with Man of Steel. It not only doesn't live up to the Rebirth-era Superman comics, but it's vastly inferior. Rogol Zaar, a character whose name I will never remember unless I have to look it up each and every time I talk about this guy, is one of the most forgettable villains I've seen in some time. The name is awful, the backstory is awful, and the design is just bland and forgettable, much like this series as a whole. It introduces some new plot lines with that Melanie whatever girl who's trying to figure out what's going on with these fires being started in Metropolis. Apparently, as we find out at the end of this miniseries, the result of Superman's actions himself, though as we later learn that's a whole other complicated matter. And we spend the rest of this series basically watching Bendis try and sell us on a very bland and boring villain, which he attempts to do by one of the laziest writing techniques out there in the modern comic book age, destroying something valuable that fans care about in an effort to artificially raise stakes. And I'm not dead set against this in and of itself. Doing stuff like that can make villains feel real and intimidating, but it feels like this is part of a horrible habit that I've seen both Marvel and DC do, even in recent years, destroying cool aspects of their own world building at the gain of nothing. This doesn't make Rogol Zaar seem like much more of a threat because we've just been introduced to him, so it's too early for this sort of thing, and it doesn't work. The characters aren't given enough time to mourn it either. We get a little bit of that, and what we get of that is very good. Seeing Kara's reaction to Kandor's destruction, and the Justice League coming together to mourn the loss of this tiny little city, that was memorable stuff, but it's a small moment, and the rest of the time was spent dealing with Rogol Zaar and fighting him over the course of 6 issues, which is drawn out and boring like crazy, as well as gradually finding out through piecemeal information what happened to John and Lois. Which isn't a very good plot to begin with. The only gain I could see out of it that seemed tangible and I kind of get what they were doing was aging up John's character a little bit. Which is fine. In fact, most of what I've just talked about, the destruction of Kandor, the time spent doing this stuff, the sending off Lois and John for a little while away from the story, all of that would be okay in and of itself if it were done properly and done in a way that told an interesting story. That's not what Bendis did here. And it leaves me with this sad, hollow feeling on the inside, like Bendis scooped out all the life and fun out of the Tomasi and Jurgens comic books when they were writing Superman before Bendis. In fact, it's worth noting that those two series by Jurgens, Tomasi, and their associated artists each stood a chance at getting into the best of comics list for 2018 based on our viewers' votes. They didn't quite make it into the top 10, but they were competitive, unlike every single Bendis-based Superman comic, which, aside from Action Comics, wasn't even voted on for the best of list. Yeah, Man of Steel only got worst of votes as a series, and quite a few of them at that, in order for it to get even to the 9th place of the worst of list. And they're not wrong to have done that, and looking it over I can understand why people are frustrated with this series. Because where the Tomasi and Jurgens era Superman comics soared higher than we had seen the character soar potentially ever, this stuff feels mundane and along the lines of a mediocre Superman comic from the early 2000s. Given the nature of who Bendis is and where he comes from, where his background is, and when he kind of cemented himself as a comic book writer, it actually isn't surprising that a lot of his stuff feels dated. And this was a key mistake DC made in poaching and bringing Bendis over. They assumed he was going to be a big deal, that he is the kind of writer you can just give a character or an entire franchise over to, and he'll do incredible things with it. Right now, they're doing something similar with Grant Morrison, and so far that's going much better, because Grant Morrison is a very different kind of writer and person from Brian Michael Bendis. And even current Brian Michael Bendis is a very different person from peak era Brian Michael Bendis. I honestly didn't realize this review was going to be so long. Looking at the current time of this recording, I didn't realize I had so much to say about this miniseries. I didn't realize I was sitting on this wealth of opinions and thoughts about it and why it ended up here on the worst of list. I thought this was actually going to be a pretty short video, but as I started talking about this thing, organizing my thoughts and putting them into physical words, a lot of stuff came out, as you guys can see, and there's real issues with this comic. You'll notice I haven't talked about the art much, but that's because I love the art so much. Look at this first page of the last issue, where John just has his eyes closed and is taking in the fact that he's discovered that he's like gonna kill all these people in the future one day. It's brilliant artwork that perfectly conveys his facial expression and what's going on in the situation, starting off the issue on the perfect, somber, bittersweet, strange tone that Bendis has chosen to take. Jason Fabok's artwork, with Alex Sinclair's coloring, is phenomenal and a huge highlight of this series that really does such great work at depicting Superman. It's just so disappointing that Bendis chose to take this tone with the character which feels off, that he took away so much of the good current things about Superman and ultimately wasn't able to live up to what had been set up so far in Rebirth, and thus we're kind of left with this mediocre series. As for Action Comics and Superman proper, which would follow this, well, one of those two we're going to talk about more a little later. There's something about this series that just didn't work for me the way it should have. Between the forgettable villain, the amount of time we waste on this miniseries with stupid nonsense, and Bendis' insistence on walking away from key elements of what makes Superman great right now, even if he kind of would half-heartedly return Lois. And here's a big issue here. These characters that had been so carefully crafted, this New Earth Superman, Lois Lane from the same planet in history, and their child John, aren't behaving right in this story. Especially as we'd go on with Lois and John and the decisions they made, it just doesn't feel right. Almost as if Jor-El is controlling their minds or something, but I don't think that's actually written into the text here. Maybe that is the twist that we're going to anticipate going forward, but I doubt it. Something's going on here, and I don't know what's up with Bendis or his plans, but his insistence on bringing everything back to square one just so that he can do nothing with it is a very strange choice to me, and I guess I really didn't like this series. It's not really something I thought about or had considered going into this thing, but as I'm spelling it all out to you, that's kind of how I feel about it, and I didn't know that was in me. It's interesting. That's one reason that I'm really enjoying this worst of list, because as we formalize these things and talk about it, I'm kind of seeing everyone's votes and being like, yeah, this was awful! Why did I tolerate this thing? I'm learning a little bit about myself live on mic, and that's kind of cool. Anyways, I think that's more than long enough for this review. We'll see how I cobble it all together into something coherent, but thanks for watching. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section below. Stay tuned for the rest of this series as we get into worse and worse and better stories as we look into the best and worst of 2018 as decided by our viewers. Next up is something outside of the DC and Marvel bubble in a major way, and I'm looking forward to talking about it with our number 8 best thing out of 2018. So thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.